I bid thee welcome once again, lords and ladies of the realm. We're back for part two of our first section on medieval Europe. That would be the Dark Ages. Last time around, we saw the conditions in Europe after the fall of Rome. We also met some of the important political leaders during this time who were helping to bridge that gap from the fall of Rome into the modern times. We saw these Frankish leaders from Clovis to Charles Martel to Pepin, finally to Charlemagne. And we left off with Charlemagne. We saw how Europe was going through something of a revival under his rule. His empire had united much of Western Europe, brought stability, both political and economic and social stability, and so we saw a little bit of a revival in Europe. But when we left off, I mentioned that that revival would be short-lived, and today we will see why that is. It has a lot to do with barbarian invasions. Again, just as barbarian invasions toppled the Roman Empire, barbarian invasions are going to play a big part in making the Dark Ages a whole lot darker. And so as we look at these barbarian invasions, we'll examine what outside groups started invading Western Europe, around the 800s or so, and what impact did these invasions have. And in particular, we're going to focus in on one of those invading groups, the most well-known and probably most important out of all of them, and that would be the Vikings, the Northmen, as they called them on the European continent. Who are the Vikings, and how did their invasions of Europe and their travels abroad impact the history and the development of the medieval period? All of that to come today, ladies and gentlemen. Thus, without further ado, let's go ahead and begin. Alright, so when we left off, like I said, the reign of Charlemagne had brought political stability and economic prosperity back to Europe. There's kind of like a little light shining in the Dark Ages, and there's a real chance that Europe might finally be ready to recover from what had been a couple of centuries of pretty nasty stuff. But that prosperity is going to be short-lived because beginning in the early 800s, and really even the late 700s, waves of outside invasions are once again going to rock Europe and rip it apart just the way they had done a few centuries earlier, several centuries earlier, to the Roman Empire. We have the Muslims making a bit of a resurgence from Spain, pushing again into Western Europe, and even moving into Italy, taking parts of Italy, the islands of Sardinia, Corsica, and even old Sicily getting kicked around as it always has. We have the Slavs, the Slavic people, moving in from Eastern Europe, invading into Central Europe, while another group of people, the Magyars, are moving in from Asia. They're sort of like the relatives of the Huns, if you will, fierce nomadic horsemen coming in, and they settle in southeastern Europe in, interestingly enough, what had been the same home location of the Huns centuries earlier. But of all of these invaders, the worst of all are the Vikings. The Vikings come from the far north in Scandinavia with the intent of raiding and plundering the cities of Europe, and they are by far the worst. The Vikings are these very, very fearsome warriors who left their homes in Scandinavia for a number of reasons. A lack of economic opportunity up there, perhaps some level of overpopulation or political issues. But these Viking raiders were mainly made up of young men looking to seek out their fortunes. And that they did, looking to plunder and conquer land in Europe. And the first recorded instance of a Viking attack in Europe happened in 793 AD at a monastery in northern England called Lindisfarne. Monasteries are, as you would imagine, not very defended at all, actually not defended, period, end of sentence, and at the same time, they are filled with religious relics and treasures and gold, so it's basically like walking down the street in Detroit with a sign that says, "I carry cash, please rob me." And the Vikings sort of center in on this, and in June of 793 AD, they attack the monastery at Lindisfarne, burn and loot the place, kill a number of the monks, take others back with them in chains to be sold as slaves, and they just rob the place blind. And the attack on Lindisfarne is really the beginning of what historians like to refer to as the Viking Age, because for the next couple of centuries, Viking raids and travels throughout Europe will be a big part of life, a big part of history, and a major influence on how this region is going to develop. And the Vikings, for their part, not only are they fearsome warriors, but they're really ingenuitive. They travel in these long, deckless ships that are called longboats. A longboat has a really shallow draft, meaning that it sits really high up in the water. It doesn't go very deep under the water. And so this allows them to travel over open seas for long distances, but it also allows them to travel inland in rivers and more shallow waters. So, as a result, there is no place in Europe that is really safe from these Viking raids. No place. There isn't really many places you can hide. Most people live by water in this period of time, so that gives the Vikings really access to pretty much anybody that they want in Europe. And the Vikings are very well known for their brutal surprise attacks on unsuspecting villages and cities and towns. And really, what they're in it for is plunder, it's loot, it's wealth. They go in and they kill everything they can kill, and they steal anything of value that they can get their hands on. Whether it be weapons, whether it be jewelry, gold, treasures of any kind. It could be animals, could be livestock, could be people. Why people? Because people you can turn around and sell for slaves. The Vikings were some of the biggest slave catchers and slave traders during this time, but it was all about making wealth, making loot for yourself, and then, conquer a little land on the side as well. But I mean, they steal anything of value, they burn, and they kill everything else that they can. These guys show very little, if any, mercy whatsoever. And a lot of it has to do with their cultural beliefs and their religious beliefs. The Vikings believed that it would please their gods if they fought bravely in battle and killed their enemies. And the more they fought and the more people they killed, the more they believed that it would please their gods. And in the end of their life, they would get to go on to what they called Valhalla, which is sort of like their version of heaven. So that's partly attributes to their violent nature. But, aside from being these fearsome warriors, there's a bit more to the Vikings as well. They're also very, very skilled explorers. These guys were moving not just along the coasts of Western Europe, but as you look at the map over here on the right, they spent quite a bit of time traveling throughout Eastern Europe as well, going so far as what is present-day Kiev, all the way to the Black Sea, even paid a little visit to Constantinople, didn't have a whole lot of luck there. And the Vikings, for their part, actually played a rather large role in the creation of the kingdom, the nation that would eventually become Russia. But where a lot of people tend to focus is more in the western side of things. The Vikings sailed the Atlantic Ocean, and they explored a number of islands out in that region. Specifically, they explored and colonized the islands of Iceland and Greenland. And they also traveled as far as North America even, some 500 years before Christopher Columbus. A Viking by the name of Eric the Red, and then later Leif Erikson, went so far as to make it to North America. We know for certain that the Vikings were in a part of Canada that is called Newfoundland, although the Vikings referred to it as Vinland. And there is some evidence to suggest that the Vikings continued down the coast of North America, perhaps into what is the present-day United States, maybe as far as Massachusetts. There's some scant evidence that they may have gone as far south as Virginia even, maybe inland to the point where they might have reached Minnesota. And there are some theories, although not much evidence to support this, that they may have traveled all the way down the coast to the point where they reached Florida. Either way, these guys were prolific explorers. They're not just brutal, bloodthirsty plunderers, but they're also very prolific explorers as well. So there's a lot to these guys. Although, I mean, if you are people who live in Western Europe, if you live in England where they called them the Vikings, or you live in France where they called them the Northmen, or you lived in Eastern Europe where they called them the Rus, these guys really were just terrifying invaders, even though we know there's a bit more to them than that. So the attacks of the Vikings and these other invaders, they destroy the political stability and the short-lived prosperity that Charlemagne's empire had created in Europe. Charlemagne, for his part, as long as he was alive, he was able to hold off a lot of these invasions. But after his death, and the empire was really split between his three sons, that's when things really started to fall apart. They didn't have sort of the strength and the wherewithal that he had to keep these invasions at bay. And so the constant attacks by the Vikings and these other invaders ultimately begin to isolate the different communities of Western Europe. And this isolation serves to weaken the power of the central government and weaken the power of the kings. And due to the weakness of the central governments, we see government becoming much, much more destabilized and decentralized. And political control really sort of shifts away from a centralized government with a monarch and more towards a decentralized system where nobles and local officials basically take over control of local defense and local government. And all of this is going to lead to the development of a new political system in Europe, which we will explore in greater depth during our next session. All right, pretty brief today, but we saw how the barbarian invasions impacted Europe. They took the stability, the short-lived stability and prosperity that Charlemagne had created, and really broke it apart. We saw the groups of invaders who came in during the 800s. We saw the impact that they had. We focused in specifically on the Vikings and saw how their invasions of Europe and their travels abroad impacted history and development in the medieval period. And we'll talk even more about these guys and look at their impact once we get together in class. But these are the essential questions. Make sure that you study them and, of course, be prepared to discuss them the next time we meet. And as always, until that time, I bid you farewell.